Hello, friends, and welcome to Whisper of the Wind. 22 million views. That's a huge number for a podcast about Sammy the Bull Gravano. Why, you ask? Because this is a story about a world where betrayal is synonymous with death. A world where a mafia underboss took 19 lives with his own hands and ran a criminal empire. Forget the movies and the internet gangsters. Right now, we're going to hear about the real mafia. Part 1. Philosophy of a Killer. Sammy the Bull. Gravano was more than just a murderer. He saw himself as an artist of death, a professional who carried out his work with absolute precision, coldness, and efficiency. "When you make a mistake," he said, his voice as steady as a surgeon describing a procedure, "the last face you see will be mine." Sammy's philosophy on killing was clear, quick, clean, and without unnecessary pain. "I would never kidnap a guy, tie him up, and torture him for 3 days. That's sick," Sammy explained. "My job is to come in, put one bullet in the back of the head, and it's over." It's an honorable departure, in a way. It was this professionalism and reliability that helped Sammy climb the ladder of power in the Colombo crime family, and later the Gambino family. The bosses entrusted him with the most difficult assignments, the most important purges, because they knew Sammy would get the job done without leaving a trace and without a moment's hesitation. He drew a clear distinction between mafia violence and the senseless violence of common criminals or mass shooters. "We don't harm innocent people," Sammy asserted. "We only kill each other. When someone in our world breaks the rules, he pays the price. That's the name of the game." Sammy even argued that the mafia's presence helped keep neighborhoods safer. "In my neighborhood, there was never any rape or child abuse. If some pervert was lurking around, we'd take care of him immediately. The police didn't have to bother." It was a twisted form of justice, an order maintained by fear, but for Sammy, it was the only justice and order he believed in. He also expressed a deep contempt for the American justice system. "It's a joke," he said. "It's only for the rich. If you have money, you can hire the best lawyers and get away with it. If you're poor, you'll rot in jail." The hypocrisy of the government, according to Sammy, was worse than the crimes of the mafia. When asked about fear, Sammy had a chilling response. "From a very young age, I accepted the fact that I would either be dead or in prison for life before I turned 40. He said, "When you accept the worst that can happen, you no longer know what fear is." And it was this very fearlessness that turned Sammy into a perfect killing machine, a ghost gliding through the underworld, leaving behind cold trails of blood and terrifying stories whispered in the dark. Part 2. The Dance with Death. Inside the Mind of a Killer. To truly understand Sammy the Bull, one cannot just listen to the numbers. The number 19, the number of lives he admitted to taking, is horrifying enough on its own. But to understand the demon within, we must go deeper, witness his dance with death, and comprehend the process and psychology behind every pull of the trigger. One of the cases that shaped Sammy's reputation was the execution of Joe Colucci, a member of his own crew. Colucci was suspected of secretly plotting to overthrow Sammy's boss at the time. The order was given. Colucci had to disappear. Sammy did not act impulsively. Everything was meticulously planned down to the last detail. He recounted, "Killing isn't just about pulling out a gun and shooting. That's the easiest part. The hard part is the planning, making sure you don't leave a single trace, ensuring the victim doesn't suspect a thing until the very last second." He approached Colucci like a brother. Sammy invited Colucci to a bar they frequented, a safe, familiar place. They had a few drinks, made small talk, and shared laughs. Throughout that evening, Sammy was a close friend, dispelling any suspicion that might have flickered in Colucci's mind. "You have to become an actor," Sammy explained. "You have to bury the monster deep inside, put on a smile, and wait for the right moment." The moment came when they left the bar. Sammy offered to drive Colucci home. As the car turned onto a deserted street, Sammy's partner in the back seat suddenly wrapped a garrote around Colucci's neck. In that chaotic moment, Sammy, who was driving, remained terrifyingly calm. He pulled the car over, turned around, and looked directly into the struggling Colucci's eyes. He didn't see fear. He only saw a job that needed to be finished. After Colucci stopped breathing, they drove to a prearranged location where a grave had already been dug. They threw the body in, filled the hole, and drove away as if nothing had happened. That night I went home, had dinner with my wife and kids, and slept like a baby, Sammy recounted, emotionless. To me, it was just another day's work. No nightmares, no regrets, just the satisfaction of a job well done. It was this very detachment that set Sammy apart. He didn't kill out of hatred or anger. He killed because it was his profession, a part of the code he had accepted. He took pride in his professionalism. His victims were never tortured. Death came quickly and unexpectedly. That was the only humanity a killer like him could offer them. But there was one murder that haunted Sammy, not because of its brutality, but because of the personal relationship involved. It was the murder of his own brother-in-law, Nicholas Schibetta. Schibetta had insulted the daughter of a Gambino family boss, and worse, had gotten involved with drugs. The order came down from Paul Castellano himself. Sammy tried to plead for his brother-in-law's life, but Castellano refused. "He's your family, Sammy," Castellano said, "but he's also one of us." And he broke the rules. Sammy faced a terrible choice: loyalty to his blood family or loyalty to his Mafia family. He chose the Mafia. Sammy lured Nicholas to a construction site, saying they needed to talk. Others were waiting there. Sammy just watched as his brother-in-law was shot and dismembered. "That was the hardest thing I ever had to do," Sammy admitted, a rare flicker of pain in his eyes. "I went home and looked my wife in the face, Nikki's sister, and had to lie to her. I lived with that lie for years." This murder reveals the absolute ruthlessness of Sammy's world, a world where even family ties had to give way to the ironclad rules of Cosa Nostra. Loyalty wasn't a choice, it was a command, and the price of disobedience was always death. Part 3. The Underworld Empire. Money, power, and manipulation. Contrary to what Hollywood movies often portray, the Mafia isn't just about gangsters with guns robbing people. Their main activity, their lifeblood, is business, a distorted, parasitic, and violent form of business, but one that still follows the laws of supply, demand, and profit. Sammy the Bull was a master in this field. "I never robbed a business," Sammy asserted. "I didn't have to. I made them want to do business with me." Sammy's secret lay in two things: fear and efficiency. He dominated the construction industry in New York. Every major project, from erecting skyscrapers to pouring concrete for a road, had to have the imprint of the Gambino family. They controlled the unions. This meant they could decide which projects would be built on schedule and which would be indefinitely stalled by strikes. If a contractor wanted a lucrative contract, they had to see Sammy. Not only did they pay him a huge consulting fee, but they also had to agree to use material suppliers and labor companies designated by Sammy himself, at a higher-than-market price, of course. Anyone who tried to take a shortcut would soon realize their mistake. Their materials would be accidentally delayed, their workers would suddenly go on strike, and their project would become a costly mess. "We brought order to a chaotic industry," Sammy explained with his twisted logic. "Before us, companies were at each other's throats. Prices were unstable. We created a coalition. Everyone got a piece, as long as they played by our rules." Besides construction, Sammy had his hands in countless other sectors: waste management, the garment industry, loan sharking, and of course, gambling. He didn't run these operations directly. He licensed others to do so. A bookie wants to operate in Sammy's territory? He has to pay a weekly share of his profits. In return, he gets protection. No other gang would dare touch him. If someone welched on a bet, Sammy's guys would pay them a visit. It was an empire built on manipulation and intimidation. Sammy didn't need to wave a gun around. His reputation preceded him. The name Sammy the Bull was a warning in itself. Everyone knew what he was capable of. And in business, as in war, a threat is sometimes more effective than action. Sammy made millions upon millions of dollars. He owned luxurious homes, expensive cars, and lived a life many could only dream of. But he knew it was all built on a shaky foundation. Everything could come crashing down at any moment. And that was the price of doing business with the devil. Part 4. The Outcast Boy and the Path to the Mob. To understand the monster that was Sammy the Bull, we have to go back in time. Back to the young boy Salvatore Gravano, growing up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a harsh place where the law of the street carried more weight than the law of the government. Sammy's childhood was a series of insecurities and anger. He suffered from severe dyslexia, a condition poorly understood at the time. At school, Sammy became a target for ridicule. The teachers, instead of helping, treated him like an idiot. They would ask the class to spell complex words like chrysanthemum, Sammy recalled. But when it was my turn, they'd ask, Gravano, spell cat, and the whole class would burst out laughing. Shame turned into rage. Sammy started using his fists to fight back. He beat up any kid who dared to tease him. Violence became the only language he felt he was good at. He was expelled from one school after another, each time bringing home crushing disappointment to his parents. The breaking point came when Sammy, in a fit of rage after the principal insulted his parents, punched and broke the man's jaw. While school was hell, the streets were heaven. There, nobody cared if you could read or not. They only cared if you were tough enough. And Sammy was very tough. At 14, he found his real family. The Rampers Street Gang. Here, he was respected. Here, his fists gave him power. Sammy believed his fate was sealed by two factors: the failure of the education system to help a disabled child like him, and the environment where Mafia wise guys were treated like kings. He recounted a fateful story. One day, two union thugs came to his father's store to cause trouble, making threats. Sammy's father, a gentleman, was terrified, but Sammy wasn't. The 14-year-old boy quietly hid a gun on his person, ready to kill both men to protect his father. In that moment, I realized I was an alpha wolf, and my father was not. The instinct to protect his family with violence was ingrained in Sammy's blood from a very early age. The path from a street gang member to a mafia hitman seemed a natural progression, an inevitable evolution in the world he inhabited. Part 5. Fateful Relationships with the Godfathers. Sammy's life in the Mafia was shaped by his relationships with two bosses of completely opposite characters: Paul Castellano, an aristocratic businessman, and John Gotti, a quintessential street gangster. Sammy held a special respect for Paul Castellano, even though he participated in the assassination to overthrow him. That respect was not for Castellano as a boss, but as a family man. However, that respect shattered when Sammy discovered Castellano was having an affair with his maid in the very house where his wife and children lived. For Sammy, who always valued family, this was an unforgivable offense. How could a man do that? He lost all my respect. Castellano's moral decay, in Sammy's eyes, was one of the main reasons he deserved to die. And then John Gotti appeared. Gotti was everything Castellano wasn't. He was flamboyant, violent, and had the charisma of a rock star. Sammy was drawn to Gotti. The two of them, along with other conspirators, planned the most audacious assassination in modern mafia history. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his bodyguard were gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. John Gotti became the new boss of the Gambino family, and Sammy the Bull, Gravano, became his underboss. At first, the relationship between Sammy and Gotti was like a dream. They were a perfect pair. Gotti was the face of the family, a dapper Don who was always in the press with his expensive suits. And Sammy was the brains and the brawn, behind the scenes, the one who did the dirty work. "I did everything for this guy," Sammy said. "I fixed trials, I threatened witnesses, I bribed jurors. I put the world in his hands." But power went to Gotti's head. He became increasingly paranoid and tyrannical. The days Sammy spent in jail with Gotti before the final trial were described as hell on earth. Gotti controlled everything, from who Sammy could talk to even how Sammy's wife held his hand during visits. "He became a monster," Sammy said. Gotti's flamboyance made him the FBI's #1 target. He talked too much, bragged too much, and ultimately walked himself and the entire organization into a trap. And when the trap sprang, Gotti didn't hesitate to sacrifice his most loyal brother to save himself. For Sammy, that was the final stab in the back. The loyalty he had spent his life building was ruthlessly trampled by Gotti. When faced with the choice between rotting in jail to protect a traitor or breaking his oath for freedom, Sammy chose the second path. His testimony in court sealed John Gotti's fate. The dapper Don died of cancer in prison, a death Sammy described as rotten. Part 6. The Art of Spreading Fear. The Mafia world that Sammy once knew, a world where guns and violence were the primary language of communication, seems to have faded into the past. "They're smarter now," Sammy remarked about the modern Mafia generation. "In my day, the 70s, 80s, violence was a daily occurrence. But it's different now. So, how does a criminal organization maintain its power and dominance without resorting to bloody purges?" Sammy explained that fear can be created in more subtle ways. Killing someone is a last resort, and often unnecessary. "Imagine," Sammy said, "instead of shooting a guy, we shelve him." Being shelved from Cosa Nostra was more terrifying than death. The person would lose everything: power, respect, business connections. He would become an invisible man, shunned by the very people he once called brothers. Every door would be slammed in his face. For a man accustomed to power, it was a social death sentence, a prolonged psychological torture. This change didn't just come from within. Legal pressure, especially the RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, dealt a fatal blow to the Mafia's structure. With life sentences without parole hanging over their heads, loyalty became a luxury. Anyone could become an informant to save themselves. "Back in the day," Sammy recounted, "if one of our guys went to prison, his family would be well taken care of. His wife and kids would get a steady payment every week. That was the law. But gradually, greed and selfishness eroded even that rule. Wise guys on the outside started embezzling money from their brothers in prison, even sleeping with their wives. When these stories reached the inmates, what reason did they have to stay silent? Trust, the foundation of Cosa Nostra, crumbled from within. Sammy believes the government, by creating an environment where betrayal was rewarded, succeeded in breaking the Mafia's structure more effectively than any crackdown. "They turned us against each other," he said with unconcealed bitterness. Part 7. Confession of a Sinner. Looking back on his life, does Sammy the Bull Gravano have regrets? The answer isn't simple. He doesn't regret the violent acts he committed within the rules of Cosa Nostra. "I didn't like killing," he said, "but I was a soldier. I followed orders. And when I pulled the trigger, I felt nothing. It was business." However, he expressed a hint of sadness when thinking about the path he chose. "I wish I had other opportunities," Sammy mused. "I wish my parents could have been proud of me." He realized his life was a tragedy, a series of wrong choices leading to an inevitable end. Even after cooperating with the government and starting a new life, the shadow of his past always haunted Sammy. He would forever be Sammy the Bull, the rat, the Judas of the Mafia world. But he accepted that fate. Sammy Gravano's story is not just about crime and punishment. It is a deep look into the psyche of a man living in a parallel world, a world with a completely different set of morals and honor. It shows the fragile line between loyalty and betrayal, between a soldier and a monster. In the end, Sammy the Bull Gravano remains an enigma. He is a cold-blooded killer, a loving father, a loyal brother, and a despicable traitor. All of these personas coexist in one body, creating one of the most complex and fascinating figures in the annals of American crime. His life is a symphony written in blood, steel, and the tears of betrayal. A symphony that will echo forever in the dark corners of history. Part 8. Revelations on the JFK assassination and the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The underworld is a place rife with rumors, with half-true stories passed around in dim bars and smoke-filled rooms. Given his stature, Sammy the Bull Gravano heard many such whispers, whispers that touched upon even the most shocking events in American history. When asked about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a mysterious smile appeared on Sammy's face. "Our world and the world of politics," he said, "are much closer than you think." Sammy didn't claim to have direct knowledge, but he recounted what people said in mob circles. According to the story, the Mafia played a key role in putting John F. Kennedy in the White House. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, allegedly sought help from Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana to rig the vote in Illinois, a crucial swing state. The Mafia helped, hoping that once in power, John Kennedy would go easy on them. But they were mistaken. Instead of returning the favor, the Kennedy brothers, President John and Attorney General Robert, launched an all-out war on organized crime, with Sam Giancana and other bosses as their top targets. They felt betrayed, Sammy explained. "In our world, betrayal is a death sentence. You can't make a promise and then break it, especially not with people like us." The word on the street was that the most powerful bosses, including Giancana, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and Santo Traficante Jr. in Florida, jointly decided that Kennedy had to die. They had the motive, the means, and the ability to carry out an assassination without leaving a clear trail. Lee Harvey Oswald, according to the whispers, was just a pawn, a pathetic scapegoat. Do I believe it? Sammy shrugged. Let's just say it makes a lot more sense than the government's official story. In my world, nothing is a coincidence. Another historical mystery Sammy touched upon was the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful president of the Teamsters Union. Hoffa had deep ties to the Mafia, but like Kennedy, he had become a problem. He knew too much, talked too much, and wanted to regain control of the union after his release from prison. Hoffa was warned multiple times, Sammy said. They told him to stay quiet and enjoy his retirement, but he didn't listen. He was too arrogant. According to the story Sammy heard, Hoffa was lured to a meeting, killed, and his body was disposed of thoroughly, possibly buried in the foundation of a stadium or crushed in an industrial waste facility. "You'll never find him," Sammy concluded coldly. While these stories can't be verified, they point to a terrifying truth. The Mafia's power wasn't confined to the underworld. Its tentacles reached into the highest corridors of national power, capable of changing the very course of history. Chapter 9. Running from Ghosts, A New Life in Another. Fall after the historic trial, Sammy the Bull Gravano vanished. He and his family were placed in the Federal Witness Protection Program, WITSEC. The once notorious hitman now had a new name, lived in an anonymous town in Arizona, and tried to blend into a normal life. But a shark cannot live in a pond. Normal life was too dull, too restrictive for a man accustomed to power and excitement. "They put me in the middle of nowhere," Sammy complained. "They wanted me to work in a pizza parlor. Are you kidding me? I'm Sammy the Bull." His dissatisfaction grew. Sammy felt betrayed by the government. He believed he had held up his end of the bargain, but the government failed to protect him properly. His new name and address were constantly being leaked. He lived in constant fear that one day a Cosa Nostra hitman would find him. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Sammy left the protection program on his own accord. It was a reckless decision. He had given up the only protection he had. But for Sammy, it was better to live dangerously in freedom than safely in a cage. He settled in Arizona and started a few legitimate businesses. But old instincts die hard. Sammy couldn't escape his own shadow. He started associating with the wrong people. And before long, he was back on the path of crime. This time it wasn't murder or extortion, but a new field, drug trafficking. Sammy, along with his son and daughter, established a large-scale ecstasy trafficking ring, targeting young people in Arizona. It was a fatal mistake. Drug dealing was a taboo for the old-school mafia that Sammy had always revered. It was considered a dirty, immoral act that poisoned the community. By doing this, Sammy had broken his own code of honor. In 2000, Sammy's drug empire collapsed. He and his entire family were arrested. This time, there would be no deal. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who once made the entire mafia world tremble, the man who brought down John Gotti, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for trafficking a party drug. It was an ironic and humiliating downfall. Sammy's life seemed to be a vicious cycle of violence and self-destruction. He had a chance to start over, to live an honest life, but the monster inside him was too strong. He could not escape his own destiny. No matter where he ran or what he did, he would always be a gangster. Part 10. Echoes from the Past. 1997, the world last heard the voice of Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, on television in an exclusive interview with Diane Sawyer. At that time, the notorious hitman, once the underboss of the powerful Gambino Crime Family, had caused an earthquake by exposing all the secrets of Cosa Nostra, burying mob boss John Gotti behind bars forever. After that interview, Sammy disappeared, sinking into silence like a ghost. The world had changed. Over 2 decades passed, technology exploded, social media rose to prominence, and the United States itself underwent unimaginable political shifts. Everything was different, but had the man, Sammy the Bull Gravano, changed? Did the monster inside the killer who once took 19 lives ever find peace? When that question was posed, Sammy, now an old man with white hair and deep wrinkles etched on his face, smirked, a cold smile hiding a stormy past. "Fundamentally, I haven't changed," he said, his voice raspy. "But my life has. I no longer live outside the law. That's right. The former killer has now become a businessman, a YouTuber, a podcaster, and has even ventured into Hollywood. An unbelievable transformation. But don't let that appearance fool you. Beneath the veneer of a law-abiding citizen, mafia blood still flows in Sammy's veins. I'm still passionate about the mafia," he admitted without hesitation. For Sammy, the mafia was not just a criminal gang. It was a heritage, a culture brought from Sicily to America, a Cosa Nostra, our thing, with its own rules, laws, and honor. He believes he is a part of that history, a good part, a bad part, and certainly the most brutal part. "In my time, the golden age," Sammy recalled, "there were bodies everywhere." That wasn't a boast. It was a stark reality. Sammy doesn't shy away from his past. He frankly admits to doing terrible things, to taking people's lives. But he did so with an ironclad belief in the ideals of Cosa Nostra. And when that belief shattered, when he felt betrayed by the very brother he was completely loyal to, Sammy did the unthinkable. He flipped. The decision to cooperate with the government, to break omerta, the sacred code of silence of the mafia, turned Sammy into a cursed figure in the underworld. But for him, it was an inevitable act. When you've broken the biggest rule, all the other rules become meaningless. Now, he can sit here and tell everything, with nothing left to hide. And his story begins with his greatest enemy, the man who was once his boss, his idol, John Gotti. John Gotti, Sammy seethed, did more harm to Cosa Nostra than a dozen informants combined. In Sammy's eyes, Gotti was a show-off, a clown who loved to flaunt his flashy suits and smug grin in the papers. He turned a secret society into a media circus. "The real mafia," Sammy said, hated what Gotti did with a passion. But the real reason Sammy turned on Gotti was much deeper and more personal. It was the feeling of being stabbed in the back. Sammy recounted the moment he heard the FBI tapes where Gotti was planning to make him a scapegoat, pinning all the crimes on him so Gotti alone could walk free. The government's job is to put us in jail. Your job, John, is to protect me from that. When you play the government's role, you're no better than a sewer rat. In Sammy's world, there is no greater crime than betrayal. And it was that betrayal that unleashed the demon within him, turning a loyal underboss into the most dangerous witness the government ever had. Sammy's war with Gotti wasn't just a fight between two gangsters. It was a clash of worldviews between the honor of a killer and the arrogance of a boss. Conclusion: a voice from the grave. After nearly 2 decades in prison, Sammy the Bull Gravano was released in 2017. But the world he stepped out into was completely different. His old friends and enemies were mostly dead or in prison. Cosa Nostra was a shadow of its former self. And Sammy, the old hitman, did something no one could have expected. He became a public figure. He started a YouTube channel, a podcast called Our Thing, where he recounts stories of his life of crime to millions of listeners. Why? Why would a man who once lived and died by the code of silence now lay all his secrets bare for the world to see? Perhaps it's an attempt to control his own legacy, to rewrite his life story the way he wants it to be remembered, not as a traitor, but as a soldier, stabbed in the back by his own commander, not as a monster, but as a product of his time, a man who lived by his own code of honor. Or perhaps it's simply a new form of business. Sammy sold fear and violence his entire life. Now, with nothing else to sell, he sells his story. Blood, tears, and betrayal have become a commodity, packaged and consumed by a public forever curious about the underworld. Whatever the reason, Sammy the Bull Gravano remains a living paradox. He embodies the worst of humanity, yet is also a compelling storyteller, a living witness to a bygone era. Listening to him, one feels both revulsion and an undeniable fascination. His life is a cautionary tale, a tragedy of a man imprisoned by his own violence and choices. He had it all: money, power, respect, and fear. But in the end, lost everything. Now all he has left are stories, echoes from a grave he dug for himself a long, long time ago. Please subscribe and remember to like to support me. Thank you for listening.